Now, sugar, if you stay around my kitchen table long enough, you'll hear me say this more than once. Sometimes the good Lord sends you a nudge, and sometimes he sends it on 4 legs with a wagging tail. Was emotion. Warm, I remember the first time I heard this particular story. I was sitting right where I'm sitting now, at this old oak table with the ring from a coffee cup that nobody's ever been able to scrub out, looking at a woman who kept twisting her napkin like she was trying to wring the truth out of it. Her name was Linda. 62, soft gray hair that didn't quite behave, and hands that looked like they'd folded a lot of laundry and wiped a lot of tears over the years. She'd come by just to drop off a pie plate, she said. But the way she stayed standing instead of going back out to her car, I knew that wasn't the only thing she'd been carrying. So I poured us both some coffee, like I always do when somebody's heart starts getting heavier than whatever they're holding. And after a few sips, eyes on the steam instead of on me, she said, "June, I think our dog remembered something we didn't." Was emotion. Reflective now, that's not the kind of sentence you hear every day, even in a town like ours where people talk about their dogs like they're listing off their grandkids. So I just nodded, took a slow sip, and said, "Well, honey, you sit yourself down and tell me about it." And that's how this whole story began. I'm gonna tell it to you the way she told it to me, but I'll warn you now, I'm gonna climb inside it a little bit too, because that's how my mind works. I don't just hear a story, I start walking along inside it, feeling the gravel under my feet with the people who lived it. Pause. So, let me take you back to a Sunday evening in late October. The kind where the air is cool enough to make your lungs feel clean, but not yet cold enough to make your joints complain. The sky was that thin sort of blue that happens right before the sun decides it's had enough for the day. Linda told me she and her husband, Earl, had finished supper, early baked chicken, green beans, and the last of the summer tomatoes sliced thin with too much salt, the way their doctor told them not to. They were rinsing plates when their dog, Buddy, started his usual routine. Now, if you've ever had a dog with a schedule, you know what I mean. 4 paws, big brown eyes, tail thumping the kitchen cabinets like a drumline for "Let's Go." Buddy would sit right by the back door, leash in his mouth, and huff like, "Well, you common or not." That night was no different. Linda said she wiped her hands on a dish towel, looked over at Earl and said, "You know he's not gonna leave us alone till we take him." Earl, pretending to grumble, slid his cap off the hook by the door. "Guess we work for him now," he said. Emotion. Warm, they walked the same route almost every night for years. Out the back gate, down the sidewalk past the Johnsons' house with the faded pink flamingos, across the little side street where the stop sign leaned at a tired angle. Then a loop around the small park with the squeaky swings and the one oak tree everybody's kids had climbed at least once. Routine, comforting, predictable. When you get to a certain age, routine can feel like a soft blanket. You know where the cracks in the sidewalk are. You know which porch lights burned out permanent because nobody ever fixed it. You know who waves and who pretends not to see you. Linda and Earl knew all of it. But like most people who are used to everything, there were things they weren't letting themselves see at all. Pause. That night, they stepped outside, Buddy trotting ahead as usual. The air smelled like somebody was burning leaves a few streets over, sweet and smoky. That smell that carries you right back to being 10 years old and jumping in piles your daddy raked up. Crickets were tuning up in the ditches. A porch somewhere was playing old country too low to really hear the words, just enough to lay a little music across the scene. Buddy tugged them down the driveway, paws clicking on the cracked concrete. They turned left, same way they always did, except this time they didn't get far. halfway down the block, right past the mailbox with the dented side where the delivery truck bumped it last summer. Buddy stopped. Now, not a oh look, a squirrel stop. Full on, 4 feet planted, leash pulled tight kind of stop. Emotion, curious. "You do this a lot?" I asked her when she first told me that part. She shook her head, eyes going distant. "No, that's the thing, June. That dog, he's a creature of habit. We joke he's more punctual than Earl's old-time clock. But that night," she set her coffee cup down real careful, "Buddy just wouldn't move. Earl, of course, did what men who think they're in charge always do first. 'Come on, boy,' he said, giving the leash a gentle tug. 'We goin' this way, you know that.' Buddy glanced back at him, almost offended, then turned his head right back toward the trees at the end of the street. There's a little patch of woods there, between their neighborhood and the older part of town. Nothing grand, not a forest, just a handful of trees that never got bulldozed when they put in the houses. For years, it had been a sort of background painting in their lives, something you see without really seeing. Kids used to cut through their back when Linda's own boys were small, but then somebody put up a new fence on the far side. The city rerouted a sidewalk, and somehow people just stopped going that way. Trail grew over. Memories did too. Buddy, however, had his full attention locked right on it. He whined, low in his throat. That sound dogs make when something in their bones is unsettled. Emotion, reflective. "Maybe it's a cat," Linda said then, trying to keep the easy tone. "Or a raccoon. Or something dead he wants to roll in." They both chuckled, because that's what you do when something makes you uneasy. You reach for the nearest joke. But Buddy didn't move. Instead, he took one step toward the trees, then another. The leash stretched tight between him and Earl's hand, like a question mark drawn in midair. "Earl," Linda finally said, softer now, "maybe just let him see. He's not usually like this." Earl held on another second, pride wrestling with curiosity. Then he sighed. "All right, old boy," he muttered. "Show us what's so important." He loosened his grip just enough. Buddy didn't bolt. He didn't run. He walked, slow, deliberate, like a dog who knew precisely where he was going. "Now, honey, I know what you're thinking. All right, June, this is all real atmospheric and all, but it's just a dog sniffing around some trees. And if that's where it stopped, you'd be right. But that's not where it stopped. Not at all. As the closer they got to that little patch of woods, the quieter everything seemed to get. The sound of the TV from inside the Wilsons' house faded. The hum of a lawnmower 3 streets over seemed farther away. Even the crickets, Linda swore, seemed to pause, like the whole world took one small breath in. Buddy led them off the sidewalk and onto the grassy strip that dipped down into the ditch. The ground was soft there, old leaves and damp earth. It smelled like, well, you know that smell. Like the first day of fall that actually feels like fall. Cool dirt, rotting leaves, something that's dying, but in a way that makes room for new things later. There, tucked between 2 low branches that reached out like arms, was the mouth of a trail. To anybody else, at a quick glance, it would have just looked like a darker wrinkle in the trees. But Buddy walked right up to it and stopped, this time not in protest, but like someone who had arrived. Linda looked at it with her head tilted. "I don't remember that being there," she said. Earl squinted. "Used to be a cut through there when the boys were little," he said slowly. "Back before they fenced off the other side. But I thought it grew over." He took a step closer. "The thing is, trails don't disappear. They just go quiet. Grass grows over the dirt, leaves cover the way, branches sag lower. But underneath, the ground remembers feet. Emotion, reflective. It's like the earth got amnesia," Linda told me. But the dog didn't. Buddy glanced back at them once, and in that look, at least how Linda remembered it later, there was something like insistence. "Here," it seemed to say. "Here, this." so they stepped in. Now, I've always believed your body remembers places, even when your mind pretends it doesn't. You know how sometimes you'll walk into a room you haven't been in for years, and your shoulders tense up before you even register why? Or you'll smell a certain kind of soup, and your throat gets tight because your mama used to make it when you were sick. Memory, not just up in your head. It's down in your feet, in your hands, in the back of your neck. The second Linda's shoe hit that first patch of hard, packed dirt beneath the leaves, something in her chest fluttered. Not a soft, sweet flutter. The kind you get when you almost miss a step on the stairs and catch yourself at the last second. It was emotion, reflective. I felt like I was walking into an old photograph, she said. The trees closed around them in a way that was more cozy than frightening. Branches wove overhead, leaving the sky in little patches. The light changed, got dappled gold here, shadow there. The air was cooler too, like the sun hadn't gotten its fingers all the way in. Buddy trotted ahead, tail swishing, occasionally looking back to make sure they were still behind him. Old roots crossed their path, bumping up like knuckles. Once Linda's toe caught one and she stumbled. Earl's hand shot out, grabbed her elbow on instinct. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, but her heart was pounding a little harder than a simple stumble should have caused. Because with every step, little pieces were clicking inside her. She knew this path. She just didn't know how she knew it. They walked in silence at first. Well, the sort of silence that still has the crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig, the soft jingle of Buddy's tags. Neighborhood sounds, cars, distant voices, a dog barking 3 yards over had faded behind them. It was just the three of them now, 2 people and 1 insistent dog. A few minutes in, Earl said, "Funny, I used to play back here as a kid, but I don't remember it looking like this." Linda swallowed. "I don't remember it at all," she answered. "But something about it is, I don't know, familiar." Pause, that word hung in the air like breath in cold weather. Familiar. But he stopped again, not in protest this time, more like he was pausing at a landmark. He sniffed at a particular tree, thick trunk, bark scarred low where maybe somebody once carved initials. He scratched at the dirt a little, then looked up. Not up into the branches, up at them. And that's when it hit her. Not the whole memory, not the full picture, just a flash. Trees, laughter, her own voice, younger. A promise made with her hand slipped into somebody else's. Motion, reflective, she stopped so abruptly that Earl almost walked into her back. "Linda," she blinked. "There used to be a bench," she said softly. "Right there, didn't there?" She pointed to a little clearing just off the path, where the ground spread wider and the leaves didn't lie quite as deep, like something had once sat there, keeping them from falling flat. Earl hesitated. "Yeah," he said slowly. "Yeah, there did." He shifted his weight, suddenly restless. "You remember that?" he asked. "Yes," she said. But what she meant was, "No, but my bones do." Pause, you see, Linda and Earl hadn't always been the quiet, routine couple you'd pass on evening walks and smile at. Long before mortgage payments and bad knees, they'd been 2 teenagers with their own secret trail. Back when their whole town felt too small and too loud and too full of opinions, this little path had been their escape hatch. They'd found it by accident one summer when they were both 15, cutting through yards to avoid somebody's daddy, who didn't approve of Earl with his long hair and loud music. They ducked into the trees, stumbled through the underbrush, and come out on this very path. A hidden lane between the life everybody watched and the life they imagined for themselves. There, deep in an old park bench back then, dragged there by somebody's uncle or maybe a city worker who forgot it one day. It sat crooked, one leg sunk deeper than the others, but it held. They'd carved their initials into it one July afternoon. E+L, L+E, depending on who had the knife at the time. They'd kissed there, argued there, dreamed there. They de-promised all sorts of big things in that small clearing. We'll get out of here. We'll never be like our parents. We'll always tell each other the truth. Big words made out of young breath. Then life, as it does, had wandered in and made its own plans. Pause emotion, reflective years later, when they were married and juggling babies and graveyard shifts and tired mornings. That trail had become something else, a reminder of who they'd been, of what they'd said they'd do, of how far away they felt from that now. After a while, without ever sitting down and deciding it, they just stopped going. The bench had eventually been removed when somebody complained about teenagers drinking back there. The path got used less. Grass grew more. They paved new routes with carpool lines and grocery store aisles and back and forth from work. And somewhere along the line, both of them decided again, without saying it, that whatever had happened here could stay put. Until Buddy, standing there on that half-remembered spot, Linda felt a funny mix of things. Emotion, reflective, nostalgia, sure. Little sweetness, remembering the way Earl's hair used to fall into his eyes, and how he'd shove it back with the same hand he used now to reach for his reading glasses. But also something sharper, a prickle of sadness, a small, tight ache of disappointment at herself, at him, at the way some promises just trickle away instead of breaking clean. She looked over at Earl. He had that look men get when they're thinking hard about something and don't want anybody to notice. Jaw set, eyes narrowed, one thumb worrying the edge of his watch band. "Earl," she said quietly, "do you remember the last time we were here?" He opened his mouth like he was gonna make a joke, closed it again. "Yeah," he finally said. "Yeah, I do." Buddy sat down in the middle of the clearing, like a furry paperweight keeping them from drifting away from the moment. The last time they'd been there, Linda had been 24, Earl 25. Their youngest boy, Tommy, had just turned 3. She'd been late, not to dinner. Late in the way that made her sit on the toilet lid with her head in her hands, staring at a little white stick on the bathroom counter. It was the kind of late that meant another crib, another night shift, another year of her body not quite belonging to her. Dee asked him to meet her at the bench. She remembered now, as the pieces came together, the way her hands had shaken, how the trees seemed too close and too far at the same time. He'd shown up with dirt under his nails from changing the oil in somebody's truck on the side for extra cash. "What's wrong?" he'd said, before even sitting down. Nothing, she'd lied. Everything, she'd meant. They sat there, knees almost touching, while she told him. "I'm pregnant," she'd said. There had been a pause, a long one. He had stared at his hands for so long she started counting the veins. When he finally spoke, his voice had been low. "We can't," he'd said. Just 2 words. But they split the air in half. "We can't what?" she asked. "We can't have another baby, Linda. We're barely keeping up as it is. We're a paycheck away from Lawson, the house as it is. The boys barely see me as it is. Everything as it is, as it is, as it is, piling up between them like fallen branches." She'd said words back. She couldn't remember all of them now, standing there years later, but she remembered how hot they'd felt in her mouth. He talked about numbers. She talked about hearts. He talked about schedules. She talked about souls. Somewhere in there, the concept of choice had slipped between them like a blade. By the time they'd left that bench, nothing had been resolved, but something had cracked. In the weeks that followed, in doctors' offices and quiet car rides and nights where they pretended to be too tired to talk, they made a decision. A complicated, messy, not for anybody else's judgment decision. They did not have that baby, and they did not come back to this trail. Pause emotion. Sad, standing there now, older, softer around the middle, their dog sitting between them like a little guardian, all that came flooding back. Not in clear dialogue, not in word-for-word replay, more like standing in the ocean and having a wave hit you from the side. Linda's throat tightened. She hadn't let herself think about that day in a very long time. Not fully, not on purpose. She'd let little bits creep in sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet, and she'd hear a baby cry on TV, and something in her chest would answer. But mostly, she'd packed that memory up and put it in a mental box marked too complicated. And you know how it is with boxes we label like that. We put them on a shelf, close the closet door, walk around them for decades, until something or someone nudges the door back open. In this case, that someone had forepaws and bad breath. Earl was the first to break the silence. "It was right there," he said, pointing to a spot where the earth dipped slightly. "Where you were sittin'. I can see it clear as day." His voice had that rough edge it gets when a man is trying very hard not to sound like his eyes might be burning. Linda swallowed. "I was so mad at you," she said quietly. "That makes two of us," he replied. She blinked, surprised. "You were mad at me," he shrugged, a little helpless. "I was mad we'd even got ourselves in a place where that felt like the choice," he said. "Mad I couldn't fix it with a second job or a magic wand or I don't know, a money tree." He kicked at a pile of leaves, watched them scatter. "And I was mad you wouldn't look at me after," he added, even softer. Linda felt her cheeks flush. "I didn't know how," she whispered. Emotion. Sad she'd gone through the motions back then. Packed lunches. Scheduled dentist appointments. Called the school when the boys caught the flu. But there had been a quiet space between them where the trail used to live. They hadn't had the language then. To say, "I'm grieving something no one else can see." To say, "I did what I thought was right and I still feel wrong." To say, "I love you and I resent you and I don't know what to do with that." So instead, they'd done what a lot of couples do. They fussed about small things. The trash, the bills, the way he never put the scissors back where they belonged. They turned the big unspoken thing into a bunch of little spoken irritations. It's easier to argue about who left the milk out than it is to say, "I still wake up thinking about the child we never met." Standing on that trail now, decades later, both of them could feel that unsaid weight, thick as the damp air. Buddy let out a soft whine, nudging Linda's leg with his nose. As if to say, "Well, you gonna pet this thing or just stare at it?" She reached down, fingers sinking into the fur at his neck, grounding herself. Then, for the first time in all those years, she said the words out loud. "I think about that baby sometimes," she confessed. "I know it sounds crazy. It's been so long. But I still wonder." Earl's shoulders slumped, like somebody had finally taken a heavy backpack off him. "Me too," he said. He looked at her then, really looked, past the lines around her eyes and the gray in her hair, into the woman who'd sat on that bench at 24. "I just didn't think I was allowed to say that," he admitted. Pause emotion. Sad, they stood there a long moment, two people and one dog in a place that remembered more than they'd let themselves remember. The wind picked up, nudging the branches overhead so sunlight shifted across their faces like someone flipping pages. "Why did he bring us back here, you think?" Linda asked, scratching behind Buddy's ear. Earl tried to smile. "Maybe he got tired of the same route," he offered, voice lightening. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe he felt something we didn't know we still needed to feel." She looked around at the way the trail curved, disappearing deeper into the trees. "We left a lot here," she added. "Not just that decision, but us, who we were then, who we thought we'd be." Earl nodded. "And we never made peace with it," he said. "Now, I've lived long enough to know that forgiveness is not a light switch you flip. It's more like the dimmer on an old lamp. Turn it a little. It gets softer. Turn it back. It's bright again. You don't walk onto an old trail, say, 'I forgive you,' and suddenly years of resentment, pack up and leave like renters whose lease is up. But you also can't change what you won't name. Pa's emotion, reflective on that path under those trees, with their dog-catching smells, they couldn't fathom deer tracks, old footprints, maybe ghosts of long-gone picnics. Linda and Earl started to name some things. I blamed you, she said finally, for pushing, for saying we can't before you asked how I felt. I blamed myself, he answered, for not being better prepared, for being scared, for putting numbers before everything else. He sighed. And I blamed you, he added, for acting like I was the only one who agreed, like you didn't walk in there with me. Linda flinched. That was a sharp one, the kind of truth that lands like a rock in your stomach, because the thing she never said, even to herself, was that part of her had wanted someone else to make the decision, someone else to be the villain, so she could stay the victim. She'd handed him the script, then stayed mad he read the lines. Motion, reflective. I know, she said, tears starting to sting. I know, Earl. I didn't know where to put any of that. He looked down at Buddy, who had decided to flop onto his side and chew thoughtfully on a stick. Well, he said, seems this old dog decided for us. He gestured around. Maybe this is where we put it, back where we left it. Linda followed his gaze. A thought tiptoed into her mind. What if we did something, she asked. Not big, just, I don't know, mark this. Tree, a stone, something to say, we remember, we're sorry, we forgive ourselves. He nodded slowly. Yeah, he said, I'd like that. They didn't do it that day. Sometimes your heart needs to sit with an idea before your hands are ready to move. They finished that walk in a kind of quiet that wasn't the same as the silence they'd carried before. It had movement, like water that had been blocked by a dam, starting to seep through cracks. Buddy led them the rest of the way down the trail, which came out, unsurprisingly, behind a different stretch of their neighborhood. They'd always known these two parts of town were connected. They just hadn't used that connection in years. Guess that's where the kids used to cut through to get to the ball field, Linda said, faint smile on her lips. Guess so, Earl answered. They looped back home on the sidewalk. The houses looked the same. Mailboxes, driveways, the broken porch stepped 3 doors down. But something in Linda's chest felt shifted. Lighter in some places, tender in others. That night, she lay in bed listening to Earl's breathing and Buddy's soft snores from his dog bed on the floor. She thought about that 24-year-old version of herself on the bench. She thought about the way she'd held her own hands in her lap, like she didn't trust anybody else to hold them. And she whispered, so quietly that even the dark barely heard it, I'm sorry. I did the best I could. I didn't know how to carry it back then. Then, after a pause, she whispered the same thing again, but this time to Earl. And then, surprising herself one more time to the child who'd never gotten the chance to walk any trail at all. Pa's emotion, sad the next evening when Buddy padded to the door at walk o'clock. They didn't even discuss it. They clipped on his leash, stepped outside, turned left, and when he stopped at the same spot and looked toward the trees, they both felt that little twist of nerves, and they followed him in anyway. I guess this is our route now, Earl joked. Linda smiled. Maybe it always was, she replied. This time, they didn't stop in the first clearing. They walked a little farther. The trail narrowed in some places, widened in others. They could see where deer or kids or other dogs had occasionally disturbed the leaves. At one point, they passed a little cluster of wildflowers, stubbornly bright under the trees. I don't remember flowers here before, Linda said. Maybe we just weren't looking, Earl answered. They made it to the far end again, back out into the light, circled around, and went home. Nothing dramatic happened. No lightning bolt. No booming voice from the sky. Just an old couple, a dog, and a path that now felt possible. A few days later, on a Saturday, Linda went out to the shed. She rummaged behind the gardening tools and the box of Christmas lights that never wanted to untangle. In the back, covered in dust, she found a small wooden stake from when they'd tried to mark off a vegetable patch one year. She wiped it with her sleeve. Then she went to the junk drawer in the kitchen, the one every house has, with batteries and rubber bands and mysterious keys, and pulled out an old black marker. She stood there for a long moment, tapping the marker against the stake. Then, slowly, she wrote. Not names, not dates, just one word. Remembered. Pa's emotion. Reflective, she felt silly for half a second. And then she didn't. Later that afternoon, she told Earl she wanted to go for a walk a little earlier than usual. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask why. They leashed up Buddy, who seemed delighted at the schedule change, and headed for the trail. When they reached the clearing where the bench had once sat, she stopped. Her hands were shaking a little as she pulled the stake from under her arm. Earl's eyes softened as he realized what she'd brought. Without a word, he took the small garden trowel from his back pocket. He'd grabbed it without thinking when he saw her with the stake, and dug a little hole near the base of the tree. She pressed the stake into the earth, smoothed the dirt around it. They stood back. It was nothing, really. A little piece of wood with a word on it, but it was also everything. A marker, not for anybody else, just for them. A way of saying, we know this happened. We know we were here. We're not pretending it didn't matter anymore. But he sniffed the steak, decided it wasn't food, and lay down beside it with a sigh. Linda let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding since she was 24. Thank you, she said quietly. Earl wasn't sure who she meant, him, the dog, the Lord, maybe all three. Thank you for what? He asked anyway. For bringing me back here, she replied. For staying. For not letting me be the only one who remembered. He reached for her hand. His fingers were rough. Hers were too. They fit different now than they did when they were 15 on that old bench. But they still fit. Now, I could end the story right there, and maybe once upon a time I would have. Tie a little bow on it. Say. And from then on, they walked the trail, and everything was healed, the end. But life's not a Hallmark movie, even if it borrows some of the music now and then. Pa's emotion, reflective the truth is, coming back to that trail didn't fix every old argument. They still had mornings where Earl left his coffee cup in the sink to soak, and it drove Linda up the wall. They still had nights where she would sigh a little too loudly when he asked where his wallet was, like she hadn't been answering that same question for 40 years. The boys still lived far away, busy with their own grown lives, calling on Sundays if they remembered, missing holidays sometimes because flights were too expensive. Buddy still tracked mud in on rainy days and shed enough hair to knit a small sweater. Life was still life, but something quietly had shifted. They started using that trail more. Sometimes they'd take it on purpose. Sometimes Buddy would simply veer that way, and they'd just go with it, like a river following an old bed. They found new details each time. A tree with bark that looked like somebody's wrinkled hands. A fallen log that made a good resting spot when Linda's hip was complaining. Mushrooms that popped up after rain, little umbrellas for invisible fairies. Sometimes they talked about the past there, about that baby, about other things too. The fight when Tommy dropped out of college, the way Earl had shut down when his own father died and never really grieved, the time Linda had almost called a lawyer during a particularly bad stretch, and then hung up halfway through dialing. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. They just walked side by side, listening to Buddy's tags and the wind and their own breathing. The trail became something like a third space for them. Not the house, with its chores and memories baked into the walls like old smoke. Not the rest of town, with its eyes and gossip. and grocery store small talk. A place in between where they could be honest without worrying who might hear. And every time they passed that little wooden stake, the word remembered sat there like a gentle hand on their shoulders. You came back, it seemed to say. That's enough for today. Emotion. Warm, a few months later, winter rolled in. Not the storybook kind with snow on every branch we live in the real world down here, but the kind with cold rain, gray skies, and a chill that gets into your knuckles and stays. The trail turned muddy in spots. Leaves turned to slick brown mush underfoot. There were days when it made more sense to walk the sidewalks. They'll break a hip back there, their oldest son said on the phone when Linda mentioned they'd been using the trail again. You two be careful, their youngest added. You're not spring chickens anymore. Linda had laughed, promised they'd watch their step. But she still went. She told me her reasoning like this. I spent decades avoiding one hard path because I was scared of what I'd feel on it. I'm not about to let a little mud stop me now. It was one particularly cold afternoon. They bundled up hats, gloves, scarves, the whole elderly armor, and headed out with Buddy. The sky was the color of dishwater. Their breath showed in little puffs. When they reached the start of the trail, Buddy hesitated for a half-second, sniffed, then trotted in like always. The ground squished under their boots. They walked carefully, holding on to each other when the path dipped. At one point, Linda's foot slipped sideways, and she grabbed Earl's arm. Think that stake might just say foolish if I break my neck out here, she joked, heart pounding. He chuckled, steadying her. You're not allowed to fall unless I'm fallen with you, he said. We go down together. She rolled her eyes, but her heart warmed. The trail was bare now, no leaves on the branches, no flowers, no green. But even stripped like that, it had a certain beauty, like a face without makeup. Honest, unadorned. They reached the clearing. Little stake still stood, though the marker was a little smudged from weather. Guess we should maybe repaint that in the spring, Linda mused. Guess so, Earl agreed. They stood in silence for a while, watching their own breath mingle in the air. Buddy did his usual circle, sniffing around the base of the tree, then flopped down with his paws tucked under him to keep warm. After a moment, Earl spoke. You know, he said, I used to think we made the worst decision in the world that day. Linda glanced at him, waiting. He continued, I don't mean that I'd make the same choice again. I don't know what I'd do if I could go back, but I know we weren't trying to be selfish. We were just scared, young, tired, pressured. He rubbed his gloved hands together. I spent a lot of years thinking we were bad people for that, he admitted. But out here, walking this thing, talking about it, I don't know. I've started thinking maybe we were just people in a hard spot. Motion, reflective. Linda felt tears sting her eyes. I've been punishing myself, she said, quietly, in little ways, putting myself last, saying I don't need this, or I shouldn't want that because somewhere deep down, I felt like I didn't deserve, I don't know. Joy, maybe. She let out a small laugh that sounded more like a sigh. Look at us, she said. Two old fools finally admitting what a 20-something couple couldn't. He reached out, patted her gloved hand. I'm glad the dog brought us back, he said simply. She looked at Buddy, who had his eyes half closed, content. Me too, she replied. Time did what it does. Days stacked into weeks. Weeks leaned into months. Buddy, who'd already been gray around the muzzle when the whole trail adventure started, got slower. The vet used words like age and arthritis, and we can try some meds to keep him comfortable. The walks got shorter. It'd make it just to the beginning of the trail some evenings, not all the way through. Sometimes Buddy would sniff at the entrance, wag his tail politely, and then turn back toward home as if to say, y'all go on without me if you want, but this old body's clocking out. They never did go without him. It had become their route, yes, but it had become his story, too. One spring morning, a few years after that first strange pull toward the trees, Buddy didn't get up when Earl rattled the leash. He lifted his head, gave a little thump of his tail, and then rested it back down. Linda knelt beside him, hand on the side of his face. "Are you tired, old man?" she whispered. He licked her wrist once. They took him to the vet. They did what people who love animals have to do sooner or later. And then they came home to a house that felt wrong. Too quiet, too big for just two people and their memories. Motion sad that evening out of sheer habit, Linda found herself standing in the kitchen at walk o'clock. Earl joined her, cap in his hand, though there was nowhere to go. They looked at the back door, at Buddy's empty leash hanging on its hook, at each other. "You wanna," he started. She nodded. "Yeah," she said. "I do." They put on their jackets, opened the back door, stepped out into the evening. They walked the old sidewalk route first, their feet knowing where to go even without pause to guide them. Past the flamingos, past the leaning stop sign, toward the patch of trees. When they reached the spot where Buddy always stopped, they stopped too. For a second, both of them felt a phantom tug on a leash that wasn't there. Pause emotion, sad, feels wrong, doesn't it? Linda murmured. "Yeah," Earl said, "but feels right too. Like we ought to finish what he started." They stepped off the sidewalk, into the grass, down into the ditch, up into the trees. The trail greeted them like an old friend. Leaves underfoot, birds calling overhead, the smell of earth waking up after winter. They walked in silence, listening for something that wasn't there anymore, the jingle of tags, the soft huff of dog breath. When they reached the clearing, the stake was still there. Remembered, she reached out and brushed dirt off the top of it with her fingers. "Well, Buddy," she said, voice shaking just enough, "we remembered. You can rest now." Earl reached into his pocket. "I brought something," he said. He pulled out Buddy's old collar, the extra one they kept in the drawer, faded blue, the name tag a little scratched. He looked around, then hooked it gently around one of the lower branches of the tree. It hung there, catching the light, not in a morbid way, more like a little wind chime that didn't chime. A small, quiet presence. Linda stepped closer, touched the metal tag. The little jingle it made sounded like all the evenings that had brought them here. "And now it's not just for us," she said softly. "It's for him too." When Linda finished telling me all this at my kitchen table, her eyes were shiny but dry. She took a deep breath, the kind you take when you've been holding something in a long time, and finally put it down. "So that's what I meant," she said, "when I told you our dog remembered something we didn't." She looked out my window, where my own yard slopes down toward the woods. "I guess I mean, he remembered the way to the place where we dropped a piece of ourselves. And he didn't let us keep pretending there wasn't anything there." Pause emotion, reflective. I sat there, letting all of it settle. The trail, the bench, the stakes we plant in the ground, and the ones we plant in our own hearts. "Funny thing about dogs," I said after a bit. "They don't know about our big plans and our big mistakes. They just know where the smells are strongest, where the stories are thickest in the dirt." She smiled, a little crooked. "Yeah," she agreed. He followed his nose right back into our past and dragged us along by the leash. We both chuckled at that, but it was the kind of laugh that's half sigh. I reached across the table, patted her hand. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "That's a sacred thing, you know. Letting somebody walk that trail with you, even if it's just in your words." She squeezed my fingers back. "Thank you for listening," she replied. "Most people just want to hear the funny dog stories, not the ones where he leads you somewhere you don't want to go." Now, I don't know what old path you might have in your life. Maybe it's not a trail through some trees. Maybe it's a box in the attic you never open, a road you don't drive down, a song you always turn off halfway through. Maybe there's a conversation you've been dodging, A decision you made years ago you still carry like a stone in your pocket, heavy and familiar. We all have our no one remembers that trail places. We build whole lives around not stepping on them. We pave new sidewalks, new routines, new versions of ourselves. We walk the same safe circles night after night because it feels easier than letting our feet wander toward the old cut through. And then sometimes, if we're lucky, if we're ready, if we're stubbornly loved by something or someone, we get pulled. By a dog, by a song, by a smell, by a dream. Pause emotion, reflective. It doesn't take us back so we can drown in regret. It takes us back so we can stop pretending we never stood there in the first place. So we can say, yes, this happened. Yes, we were those people. Yes, we made that choice. Yes, we hurt. Yes, we loved. Yes, we're still here. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not to build a whole new road, but to go back to an old one, plant a little stake in the ground, and write a word on it. Remembered, forgiven, mine, home, whatever word your heart needs. Motion, warm. I think about Linda and Earl sometimes when I see an older couple walking a dog past my house. I imagine there's a trail somewhere behind them that only their feet and their hearts can feel. And I hope, when the time is right, something tugs them gently off the sidewalk, not to punish them, not to scare them, just to say, come on back for a minute, sugar. There's something here you left behind. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. Because families, to me, are a lot like those little neighborhoods. Houses lined up in neat rows, porches swept, curtains straight, everybody waving from their driveways. But behind those houses, there's always a strip of woods, a forgotten trail, a bench that used to be there. The real story doesn't just live in the front rooms where everything looks tidy. It lives back there, in the places we stopped going, in the conversations we never had, the choices we made sitting on crooked benches with our hands shaking. The good news is, houses can sag and still stand. Trails can grow over and still exist. Hearts can crack and still beat. And every now and then, if we're willing to let something smaller and braver than us tug on the leash a little, we can find our way back to the paths no one remembered. Not to live there, not to get lost in what-ifs, but to walk through, side by side, and come out the other end a little more honest, a little more tender, a little more at home in our own stories. Pause emotion, warm, so if you ever feel yourself pulled towards some old memory, some place you haven't let yourself visit in years, maybe don't yank the leash right away. Maybe loosen your grip, follow it in. See what's waiting for you under the leaves. It might hurt, it might heal. Most likely, it'll do a little of both. But if you ask me, that's how family really mends. Not just by building new rooms on the house, all shiny and bright, but by going down into the basement, opening the door to the backyard, and walking the trail that was there all along. Even if it takes an old dog to show you where it starts. Emotion, reflective, end with 200, 300 word closure. When I look back over all these stories I've carried, my own and other folks, I sometimes picture them like a row of little houses on a hill. Each one painted a different color, each one with windows that glow a bit different at night. Some have porches full of rocking chairs, every memory sitting right out front where everyone can see. Others have their curtains drawn tight, porches swept bare, like they're afraid a single muddy footprint might give the whole game away. But if you walk around behind those houses, you'll see something nobody shows on the Christmas cards. Tiny gates that stick when you open them. Little worn patches in the grass where feet used to go. Old stepping stones half buried in dirt. That's where the real life is. That's where the fights happened, the whispered apologies, the broken promises, the secret kisses, the decisions that still snag at people's hearts decades later. We like to pretend we live only in the front rooms, in the birthdays and graduations and smiling photographs. But truth is, we are shaped just as much by the times we stood out back, staring at a path we weren't sure we were brave enough to walk. Families are not perfect blueprints, more like old farmhouses, built in pieces, rooms added on when a baby came or an in-law moved in, doors painted over and opened again. And out past the property line, there's almost always a trail no one talks about. The one you used to take, the one you vowed never to go down again, the one somebody led you down once, and you're still not sure how you feel about it. The miracle isn't that some folks never get lost. It's that with a little courage, a little honesty, and sometimes the stubborn pull of a dog who just won't turn back, we can go find those trails, walk them together, and come home different. Not brand new, not fixed, just a little more whole.